The forest had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary for the creatures who had learned to thrive in its solitude. Towering trees, their roots entwined in the earth like ancient secrets, spread their thick canopies, blocking the sun and creating an eerie, humid atmosphere. Beneath their shade, the ground was alive with motion. Ferns swayed gently in the breeze, insects hummed in the still air, and the occasional rustle of a hidden creature stirred the underbrush. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, nature had long held its dominion. Yet there was one creature who could not escape the growing tension in the air: a single red crab. Its shell, a brilliant hue of crimson, stood out like a beacon against the rich brown of the forest floor. It had been days since the rains had come and the humidity was rising. The monsoon, though delayed, was finally nearing its return, and with it, the chance for the crabs to emerge from their damp burrows, breathing life back into the dry land. But this crab, the last of its kind, had remained trapped in the depths of its burrow, its limbs aching with the stillness. The crab's world was small, confined to the shadowy labyrinth beneath the earth, yet it knew the forest above. The sounds, the smells, the vibrations of the land, they were familiar, even comforting. Yet today, something was different. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. The sounds were muted, as if nature itself had held its breath. A faint creaking of trees sounded far off, but it was too faint, too distant to determine the source. It made the crab uneasy. The monsoon, after all, was not merely a return of moisture. It was a violent, unstoppable force, a reminder of nature's power. The crab's movements were slow, deliberate. It had grown accustomed to the rhythm of waiting. But something tugged at the edges of its consciousness, a subtle vibration, the earth beneath its claws trembling faintly. The crab froze, sensing the shift, its body tightening in response. It wasn't the coming of the rain, it was something. The forest, too, seemed aware of the intrusion. Birds scattered, their calls sharp and desperate. The rustling in the underbrush intensified, growing louder and closer until it reached a crescendo. The ground quaked and the crab's senses were overwhelmed. It scuttled deeper into its burrow, its heart racing. But the vibrations didn't subside. They grew, pressing in from every side, until it was impossible to discern the cause. The crab's natural instincts screamed for it to retreat, to hide further within the damp earth, but it couldn't escape the growing weight of the world around it. Then, through the dense foliage above, a shadow passed, swift, dark, and enormous. The crab froze once more, its tiny body trembling as the shadow circled above, drifting like a cloud, blocking out the light. From the depths of its burrow, the crab could feel the movement above, an unnatural presence that hung heavily in the air. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely now. No more birds, no more insects, no breeze. The only sound left was the thumping of the crab's heartbeat. The ground beneath it trembled again. This time it was a deep, resonating thud, as though something massive had landed nearby. The crab, its mind clouded with dread, darted out of its burrow, its claws scraping against the moist soil. It was desperate to escape, to find a place deeper, more hidden, but the ground was shifting, the surface crumbling beneath its feet. It scuttled faster, but the earth seemed to close in around it, the familiar path it had once known now unfamiliar, disorienting. The presence above loomed closer. A long shadow stretched across the forest floor. The vibrations in the ground intensified as the creature above took a step closer. The air was thick, the world closing in around the last crab. The crab knew it was running out of time, out of space. It had no more safe places to hide. But then, in the silence that followed the next tremor, it happened. A sudden, crushing weight descended. The crab, struggling to move, was struck by an immense force, a series of powerful limbs, sharp and unyielding, pushing the earth in every direction. It was a predator, a creature that had never been part of this ecosystem. The crab, too small and too slow, was caught, unable to retreat to the safety it had once known. The sense of unease that had begun as a murmur had escalated into an undeniable force. And yet, as the last moments of the crab's life ticked away, there was a twist to its fate. The creature that had descended upon the crab, a hulking, grotesque figure, was not the predator it seemed to be. The crabs had known no enemies, only the forest's cyclical harmony. This figure, a foreign creature, had arrived only to disrupt that harmony, unaware of the damage it caused. In the wake of its rampage, a change swept through the forest. The earth trembled once more. But now it was not just the vibration of a predator, it was a shifting of the natural order, an unsettling promise that the balance was no longer whole. As the last crab lay lifeless beneath the weight of the world it had known, the shadow above began to retreat. The forest fell silent once more, though the echoes of the disturbance remained. Soft, haunting, and undeniably present, something had shifted. A line had been crossed. The story of the last crab, once a simple tale of survival, had become the first chapter in a greater narrative. The forest, now altered forever, waited for what was to come next. The days that followed felt unnatural, as though the world itself had been muted. The monsoon, which had once been a life-giving force, now loomed like a specter, uncertain and distant. The rain had begun to fall, but it came in scattered bursts, a teasing promise that was never fully realized. The forest, once teeming with life, seemed to hold its breath. Where there had been vibrant sounds of the birds and the rustling of smaller creatures moving in the underbrush, now there was only a deep, unsettling silence. It was as though the entire sanctuary was on the edge of waiting for something, but no one knew exactly what. For days, no one ventured near the area where the last crab had been lost. The presence of the foreign creature above had left behind an invisible mark, a scar on the land that no one could see, but everyone could feel. Even the trees seemed to bend inwards, their trunks growing heavier, their limbs twisting with an inexplicable weariness. The once thriving ferns that had dotted the forest floor with their lush green fronds now wilted and turned brown, as though they had been drained of their life force. The few remaining crabs, scattered and disoriented by the loss of their kin, moved slowly through the underbrush. They seemed confused, lost in the absence of the familiar rhythms they had known for so long. Many of them, too, retreated back into their burrows, their bodies heavy with the strange weight of uncertainty that hung in the air. But it wasn't just the crabs that felt the change. The creatures of the forest, rabbits, deer, and even the solitary snakes, began to exhibit unusual behavior. They no longer moved freely through the trees, no longer wandered as they had before. Something in their instincts told them to be wary, to avoid certain areas of the sanctuary, as though they knew that the balance of their world had been irrevocably altered. It was in this strange, disquieting stillness that a new presence began to make itself known. At first it was subtle, a slight rustle of leaves where there should have been none, a flicker of movement in the distance that caught the eye but quickly disappeared when one looked too closely. As the days passed, however, this presence grew bolder. One morning, just before dawn, the first of the birds returned. A lone crow perched high in a dead tree let out a single sharp caw that broke the silence. It echoed through the forest, sharp and intrusive. Then another bird joined it, and another, until the forest was filled with the unsettling cacophony of the birds' calls. But there was something different about these birds. Their calls were frantic, desperate, as though they were trying to warn something the animals of the forest had not yet understood. The vibrations, faint at first, started once more. This time they were stronger, more deliberate. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the pressure of an unseen force. And then, for the first time since the last crab had been lost, the presence revealed itself. At the edge of the forest, near the clearing where the monsoon had failed to truly come, a dark shape appeared. It was massive, larger than any creature the sanctuary had ever known. Its form was outlined against the fading light, its movements slow but purposeful. It wasn't the predator that had ravaged the land, it was something else. Something born of the imbalance that had followed in the wake of the creature's intrusion. The forest trembled once more as the dark shape moved closer. The earth shook beneath its feet, and the once deep silence was broken by a low, guttural growl. It was as though the land itself had been awakened from a deep slumber, and now it was unsettled, angry, ready to lash out. The creatures of the forest, despite their fears, began to gather at the edges of the clearing. They moved cautiously, uncertain of what to do, but drawn by the pull of the strange energy that filled the air. Their instincts told them to remain hidden, to retreat, but they could not resist the pull of something greater, something that beckoned them, whether they understood it or not. The dark shape in the clearing stopped, its form now fully visible. It was not an animal, not in the way the creatures of the forest understood it. It was a force, a manifestation of the land's anger, a physical representation of the disturbance that had taken place. It was as if the forest itself had grown tired of the imbalance that had been introduced, and now it was preparing to reclaim what had been lost. The animals in the forest, rabbits, birds, deer, and even the last remaining crabs, watched from the shadows as the dark shape moved across the clearing. It was not a creature that could be fought. It was a force that could only be observed, a force that embodied the consequences of the disruption in the natural order. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the dark shape began to retreat, its presence fading into the distance. The ground ceased its trembling, and the forest seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But the damage had been done. The imbalance was no longer something that could be ignored. The forest had learned that even the smallest disturbance could ripple through the very fabric of life, leaving behind a legacy that could not be undone. In the days that followed, the crabs began to emerge once more, but they were different. The last of them had been lost, and the sanctuary, once a place of perfect harmony, had been irrevocably altered. The creatures that had once thrived in this peaceful refuge now moved with caution, always aware of the fragile nature of the world they inhabited. And the forest, ever patient, awaited the return of its rhythm. Though it was clear now that the world, like the last crab, could never truly go back to what it had once been. The days turned into weeks, and the forest seemed to settle into a new kind of stillness. The monsoon rains, which had once felt like a great cleansing force, now came in fits and starts, sometimes heavy, sometimes nothing more than a light mist that hung in the air, teasing the land with promises of moisture it couldn't quite deliver. The air remained thick with humidity, and the once green ferns that had dotted the forest floor continued to wither. Yet despite this slow decay, life pressed on, adapting to the changing world. The remaining crabs began to reappear, but there was no joy in their movements. They were no longer the vibrant, energetic creatures that had once rushed out of their burrows when the rains came. Now they emerged hesitantly, their movements slow and deliberate. They scuttled through the underbrush, their small bodies gliding over the damp earth, searching for sustenance, but always with an air of wariness, as if the forest itself had become a place of danger rather than refuge. The few crabs that survived had lost something in the wake of the chaos, something that could never be reclaimed. And then, one day, something else began to stir in the heart of the forest. A low, almost imperceptible rumbling echoed through the trees. At first, it was easy to dismiss, just the wind, perhaps, or the distant sound of thunder. But the rumbling grew louder, more frequent. It was not the sound of a storm rolling in, nor the passing of some large animal. It was the sound of the earth itself, shifting, moving in ways it shouldn't. The forest, ever watchful, sensed it. The crabs, more attuned to the rhythms of the land than most, stopped in their tracks. The trees, their ancient limbs creaking in response to the vibrations, seemed to lean in, waiting. The animals of the forest, so accustomed to their own quiet ways, now hesitated in their actions. Birds perched silently on branches, their eyes wide with alertness. Deer and rabbits, frozen in mid-motor, stared into the distance, sensing the approach of something neither predator nor prey, but something far more dangerous. As the rumbling continued, it became clear. It wasn't just the land shifting beneath them. Something was coming from deep within the earth. The deep, persistent tremors suggested something powerful, something that could not be ignored. The crabs, once so sure of their place in the forest, felt it too. They began to retreat, digging deeper into their burrows, but this time there was no safety in the soil, no shelter from the unknown presence that was drawing nearer. The forest grew darker as the strange rumblings persisted. The light filtering through the thick canopy was now dim and foreboding, as if the sun itself had been blocked by some unseen force. The creatures that had once filled the air with sound, the birds, the insects, the small mammals, were now gone. All that remained were the crabs and the trembling earth beneath them. At last, the source of the disturbance revealed itself. It was not a creature, not a predator or some animal seeking to disrupt the delicate balance of life. No, it was far more ancient than that. The ground split open, not with the violent force of an earthquake, but with a slow, deliberate tear that seemed to draw from the deepest parts of the earth. A vast fissure stretched across the clearing, its edges jagged and sharp, exposing the raw, dark soil beneath. From the depths of the crack, a strange, thick fog began to rise. It curled upward like tendrils of smoke, seeping into the air and filling the space with a choking weight. The fog seemed alive, undulating, as if it were a living entity, searching, reaching, claiming. The crabs, now huddled together in their shallow burrows, could only watch in horror as the fog spread across the forest floor. The vibrations from the crack intensified, and with them came the unmistakable sound of something crawling from within. Slow, deliberate movement that resonated with the pulse of the land. The crabs, drawn by the need to escape, tried to scuttle further into their burrows, but the earth beneath them was shifting, and the burrows began to collapse, dirt crumbling around them as the very foundation of their world seemed to crack open. The fog was swallowing the forest, creeping between the trees, suffocating the life around it. Even the air had changed, growing thick with the stench of something foreign, something corrupt. The first of the crabs, in their panic, tried to climb the side of the fissure, their claws scraping desperately against the earth as the fog closed in. But it was no use. The tendrils of mist curled around them, tightening, pulling them into the darkness. The forest around them seemed to vanish. Its towering trees, the underbrush, the faint rustling of life, all swallowed by the growing abyss. Then, just as the last crab vanished beneath the veil of fog, there was a moment of stillness. And in that moment, the earth, the forest, and everything within it seemed to hold its breath. The fog had consumed everything, and now there was only silence, a silence that spoke of a final, irreversible change. In the weeks that followed, the forest began to heal, but it was no longer the sanctuary it once had been. The creatures that remained, the ones who had managed to escape the creeping fog, found themselves in a new world. The monsoon came, but its rains fell on a different landscape, one scarred by the deep crack that now ran through the heart of the forest. The crabs, the last of their kind, were gone. Their place in the forest had been erased, as though the very earth had swallowed them up to make room for something else, something ancient and unknowable.